All right, hello everybody, and welcome to this webinar event. My name is Melanie Turek, and I am an analyst with Frost & Sullivan. And I had started the presentation and was told that some people couldn't hear me, but I think that should be working now. So I'm just going to go ahead and kick things off. I am a VP and fellow of research for connected work at Frost & Sullivan. And as such, what I do is I cover all of the enterprise communications technologies that most folks have to deal with when they are working for an organization. So that's everything from voice communications, conferencing, social networking, instant messaging, email, pretty much anything you can think of that's kind of a communications or collaboration tool. And one of the things we do at Frost every year is we put out a survey of our IT decision maker clients, and we ask them every year to talk a little bit about what they're doing when it comes to communication and collaboration. So what that means is we're basically asking them a series of questions. Usually it's the same ones year over year, and getting some kind of a sense of where they are when it comes to enterprise communications and collaborations tools. And what we found really over the last several years is an enormous trend toward working remotely, working from somewhere other than a traditional corporate office. So I wanted to share with you some of the research that we found just in the last year or so, or sorry, just in the last few months or so. All of this took place before COVID-19, but as we are now all aware, it's only going to get, I think more intense as we go forward, both through kind of dealing with the virus over the next months, maybe even year or so, but also well beyond that, right? So keep in mind that some of the data I'm about to present to you is actually a little bit old in the sense that it came before COVID-19. But as I go through some of these slides, I'll talk a little bit about, kind of how we expect some of these things to change one way or the other based on kind of where we are now with this. Of course, even before most of us were working at home, just because we had to, we saw that, a lot of knowledge workers were already doing so in some way or another. So for some people, that meant occasionally working from home. For other people, it meant doing so on a full-time basis. In most cases, it's actually kind of a blend where you'll have knowledge workers who maybe are working a couple days a week from home, a couple days a week from a client site, and that kind of thing. But regardless, all these disparate mobile workers really need a way to keep in touch. They need to be able to communicate with one another. They need to be able to collaborate effectively with one another, even when they're not in person. And of course, they need to be able to work with their customers and their partners as well. And so one of the things that we do with this research is we really try to get a sense of where companies are at when it comes to the kinds of technologies that you need to deploy in order to support this increasingly virtual workforce. And as I say, the data that I'm going to take you through occurred before COVID-19 changed everything. And as I go through some of these slides, I'll talk a little bit about some of the changes we expect to see even more so. So when we do just a quick snapshot of, what companies are using in terms of technologies right now, you can see that mobile worker applications and devices, so smartphones, tablets, to some extent watches, and then the applications that are designed for those tools are basically in use everywhere. And communications and collaborations tools are also being put into place. So those kind of overlap sometimes. Obviously, if you have a mobile phone, you've already got your telephony in place, but you might then layer on a distinct teaming type of application or additional types of communications applications on top of those devices. So clearly, companies are recognizing that essentially all of their employees are mobile to some degree, and that they have to support those employees as a result. We also like to take a look at who's making decisions around technology, and you can see it still very much lies with the IT department and with the C-suite within that kind of IT sector, so the CIO or CTO. We do get some input, if not sign-off, final sign-off from department heads. So those would be folks who are in probably lines of business, but they want to be able to weigh in on the kinds of technologies that their employees are using in order to communicate and collaborate. Interestingly, here you do also show a fair number of companies are asking for input from their end users, their employees. I would like to see that number go up, frankly, but it's higher than it has been in the past. So I think that that's a very good sign. We also see that today consumer technology is influencing enterprise solutions very, very much. So in a small number of cases, it's actually considered crucial, but it's very influential in the majority of organizations. And that's another really important shift that we've seen. So even though maybe the end users are actually weighing in on these purchases in only about 15% of the cases, nevertheless, the people who are making those buying decisions are taking into account how well enterprise applications and enterprise tools can mimic what we all use in our day-to-day consumer lives. And this is very important because typically those consumer applications are going to be intuitive. They're going to be very familiar with end users. And so you do kind of have this expectation at this point that anything that you're using at work is going to be at least as easy to use and as effective as what you are using in your day-to-day life as well. Mobile apps, as you saw, are a key component of any kind of enterprise digital solution purchase. And again, not really surprising, right? When you have more than 50% of your employee base, even on a regular basis, working outside of the office, you need to be able to support them. Obviously, today, that's even more important, right? So right now, with all of us working from home, generally speaking, those mobile apps are absolutely critical. And what we're going to find, I think, is that changes even more so over time. So that what I expect to see is companies are going to want to have mobile apps for just about any kind of enterprise solution that they're putting into the office. So even if employees are normally expected to use the tool on a PC, they will need to have mobile capabilities available to them at all times, just in case. Certainly in case of another situation like what we find ourselves in now, but also so that they can be increasingly mobile down the road, as they want to and as their companies need them to. We also see that as companies take into account, kind of what their end user population wants and needs, they are looking at that based on demographics in a lot of cases. So, you hear a lot about how millennials and Gen Z is really kind of changing things in the workplace. And the issue there is that you want to make sure that as they come into that workforce and start to really influence it because of their numbers, that you are responding to their needs. And it's interesting because on the technology front, there is really that dividing line between millennials and everybody who came before them. And we've seen that over the last 10 years, 12 years or so. As they start to come into the workplace, right, the influences they bring with them in terms of what they're expecting from communications is clear and significant. One generation behind them, that Gen Z, they're often called digital natives. And so I do also expect them to have significant influence here as well. So where millennials kind of came into things, growing up with a lot of the tools that we currently use all the time and take for granted, those digital natives really just don't know a world without it. And what that means, one of the things I studied way back in college was anthropology. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about that is kind of how we think about the way that we interact with the world around us and with technology. And so for these digital natives, for them, interacting with technology, with tools and apps, it's like seamless. They don't even think about it. And so from a corporate perspective, you need to make sure that you're starting to approach your technology investments, especially around communications and collaboration, from the point of view, not that it's so much enabling technology, but it's essentially foundational to how these folks operate within any kind of organization. So certainly within your business, but also, in their personal lives and consumer lives and so on. Now, when it comes to adopting new enterprise digital technologies, we know that companies really want to emphasize flexibility and collaboration. So what you can see is, they're really, even before COVID-19, trying to support a lot of different ways of working. And they're doing this in a number of different ways. Part of that is how they are supporting mobile workers, people who work outside of the office. Part of it, though, affected how they designed those offices in the first place. And what we saw is that a lot of those organizations moved over the last 5-7 years or so to an open office plan. Right. And sometimes it's called hot desking, but where, typically you show up for work, there's an empty console somewhere, a seat, you sit down, you log in, and that's where you're working for the day. And then they might have breakout spaces, huddle rooms, even things that are sort of mimicking phone booths, a lot of video conferencing rooms, things like that, where people can go. That is about to change. There's no doubt about that. So although the trend for that was to move, I would say, more toward that, more in that direction, definitely what we're going to see is companies backing off from that now. So as a result, what that means is, although it isn't reflected in this data, we fully expect more companies to start building back those cubicles, to some extent private offices, or at the very least finding ways to close off the so-called open office, putting up partitions, plexiglass, that kind of stuff. That's going to happen for, health requirements, and that's going to come down from different localities and states, as well as just best practices within an organization. But in fact, what we find is a lot of employees really welcome the change. So the move to open offices, even though it remains significant, kind of paramount in terms of the directionality of investment, that was never very popular with the people who had to sit and work in those open offices. So that shift will happen for one reason, but I think in the end it will be welcomed by a lot of folks who, when they eventually go back to work, will have a slightly different way of doing their work in those offices. And so again, you can see some of that broken down here where, 6 months ago when this data came out, 29% of companies were expecting to significantly increase those. Another 41% were going to somewhat increase them. I think you can expect those numbers to go down, if not disappear to zero altogether at this point. And we're going to start to see a lot more private offices and cubicles come up. But when we look at, okay, what kinds of technologies now are you investing in order to support, productive open office work, that I don't think is really going to change all that much. So the need for desktop communications and collaboration tools, the need for, wireless devices and peripherals, and even the need for huddle spaces is going to stay the same. Because again, you're going to need to be able to support people who may come into an office, sit down and work in a cubicle or a private room, but then need to be able to work from home at the drop of a hat, who need to be able to work, from the road, from client sites more and more. And so in a sense, the kinds of technologies that one uses to support an open office are the same kinds of technologies that you would use to support a mobile workplace in a lot of ways. And so those investments, I don't think will really change. Now, when we ask companies, okay, well, why are you investing in some of these technologies? What are you hoping to gain from it? Improving teamwork is number one. It's top of mind. We want to also improve our information management and our customer experiences. So that first one, improving teamwork, again, what we found is, with the open office concept, the idea was that, well, if you have everybody in the same room sitting next to each other, and sometimes you mix those seatings up. In other words, any given day, different people are sitting near or next to one another. You're going to enable a lot of sort of natural collaboration and innovation. What we found is, in fact, that is not what happened, because in order to be able to focus and actually get work done, people who are sitting in those open office environments are putting on headsets. They're playing music, and they are trying to limit the amount of noise and disruption around them as much as possible. Well, in the process, of course, they also eliminate that kind of organic collaboration. On the other hand, desktop applications that allow for that kind of teaming, that are built not just for the communication component, so you can get, Zoom and get everybody video calling in or dialing in, sharing files in real time. All of that stuff is very important. But you also need to have, workflows built into those tools for them to be properly effective. So places where you can store and access documents, for example. So that, a project can sort of have a place to live, and people can have a place to collaborate on that work, and it's persistent, right? And so it's always there. So that's where things like improving information management come into play. Collaboration isn't just about that aha moment where 2 or 3 people kind of happen upon each other, share an idea, and now we're off to the races and everything's great. Collaboration actually is something that typically happens over time, and it has to be, kind of as thoughtful a process as individual work. You really do need to treat it with care. You need to make sure that you have the tools and the processes in place to support that kind of work and that kind of investment. And so again, that's where these kinds of new tools and technologies that are collaborative focused really come into play. And they don't have to happen in an open office space in order to be valuable or useful. So I do think that we're going to continue to see those tools being deployed, but for slightly different reasons. You can also see here that a lot of these tools are already given to a lot of employees within different organizations, and they are in use today. So team spaces, like I was just talking about, things like Slack and Microsoft Teams, already in use today in almost 2/3 of all companies, and another third or so expect to put them into use over the next couple of years. So you can see, the same thing with desktop and mobile voice, and you see clients and so on and so forth. A lot of companies are also depending on consumer messaging and calling services. And of course, we've seen that explode right today as well. So as soon as everybody started to work from home, Zoom just absolutely ballooned, right? Same thing, people using Skype and Google, just to make those video calls. I do think that over the next few years, as companies start to both recognize that this is something they have to support, and also recognize that, hey, wait a second, there are in fact some security and privacy issues when it comes to some of these consumer services, that companies will want to start to rein that usage in, and they'll want to start to deploy tools that they can more fully control. And you can see that, a lot of companies are using a lot of different solutions. So it's a nice mix of tools. And this is important too, because not every technology is right for every use case. So depending on what you're trying to do and who you're working with, you might need desktop video and web conferencing. Eventually, we may be able to all go back into the office, at which point you might want conference room-based video conferencing or smaller huddle rooms, for different kinds of interactions. But what you can see is companies are in fact making good investments in pretty much all of these technologies. Now, most organizations are kind of making decisions about who gets these tools according to two things. Either they're just giving them to everybody, and by everybody I mean knowledge workers, typically, especially for things like conferencing and collaboration tools. Or if they're not doing that, they're making the distinction based on job roles. And that makes a lot of sense because, in fact, not everybody needs to have access, for example, to desktop video and web conferencing. Not everybody needs to be able to share slides or make presentations, right? So depending on what your job role is, that might be a tool you need. Same thing with access to, for example, certain conference room technologies or team spaces and the like. So we are seeing a much more, kind of significant impact of those job roles. And then you can see the rest is pretty much based on location again. So where are you, either within the world and perhaps within the world in relation to the rest of the organization, or where are you in terms of how you work. So if you're a person who regularly works from home, you might get a few more of these tools than if you routinely, for example, go into the office. Now, of course, companies regularly deploy tools and technologies, but they don't always get used very often. That is not really the case with many of these, however. Of course, most of us are going to be using our voice tools throughout the day, certainly email and instant messaging. But even when it comes to conferencing, we're starting to see much wider adoption, much more regular use of these capabilities. Interesting to me, some of the most popular applications here are, again, those consumer messaging and calling services. And I think a lot of the reason for that is it's kind of default. It's what we're all used to using in our personal lives. And so we kind of default to them when we're at work. And then a lot of use of those team collaboration tools that I've been mentioning, the things like Slack and Microsoft Teams. And those are, again, really important when you're trying to drive collaboration throughout the organization, because not only are they about communication, but they're also about that, second very important component of having documentation and being able to actually work on work product and not just, talk, not just hold meetings. You'll also see a lot of use of headsets. That is primarily driven by those open offices. So as those open office spaces start to decline, we may see that headset usage also start to decline. Although, again, I think, the more you increase video conferencing and web conferencing tools, having a headset is, particularly valuable. And of course, more and more of us have those earbuds with us anyway. So even if a company isn't giving them to us, we might still find a way to use them, even if we're in cubicles or private offices. When we ask companies, what are some of the benefits that you're seeing from these tools? You can see there's, fluctuation, obviously, depending on the technology you're talking about, but you get a pretty good sense, of what's most important. And clearly that's improving productivity. That's the sort of olive green color that you can see there. So kind of right in the middle, right? So that's the biggest chunk where we're seeing benefit, is just getting people more productive. And then you can also see they're helping with employee satisfaction, and they are making for an overall better customer experience as well. Now, we do also ask, okay, who is supplying these tools for your organization? And a slight majority of companies are using a variety of products from a variety of vendors. As a result, they're not necessarily well integrated, although we find that's kind of true sometimes, even when they have a single vendor supplying a lot of their different solutions. They're not always super well integrated across the solutions, or perhaps across the delivery mechanism. So when we talk about hybrid solutions being quite common, a hybrid solution is a mix, right, of cloud-based and premises-based technology. Even if you get those from the same vendor and just a single vendor, that integration can still be a little tricky. So, here we clearly haven't settled overall on any kind of design that really is working for everybody. You can see premises-based products from multiple vendors that are not integrated is the most common, but, not by much, right? So lots of different ways that companies are deploying and kind of handling how they're managing these different types of solutions. One of the big trends that we see in communications and collaboration, and in fact in tech overall, is around artificial intelligence. And Initially, you didn't see a lot of AI around communications per se. It was often going to be starting out used in the back office much more. But we're seeing it come to that front office because it can add actually a lot of value. It can add value to helping people search for information, both in terms of documents, but also in terms of people. So that kind of human resource element. It can help certainly on the contact center side when it comes to supporting those customer experiences. And companies are certainly understanding that. So you can see about 38% say that AI is very relevant when they're considering how to enhance their communications, or somewhat relevant to 41%. Not too many organizations are just sort of ignoring the idea of AI. And mostly that's because it can speed and improve communications and lower overall costs. So the goal here really is to make sure that the communication experience is both better. In other words, it's going to be contextually relevant. You're going to be able to pop up information to the folks involved in a way that matters to them at that very moment in real time. And it's also going to hopefully make things, faster overall. So then that time savings is going to reduce labor costs and ultimately kind of shrink the manual processes, or the time manual processes take, and then that's going to help you save some money as well. But not everybody is buying into AI all the time. They do have some concerns. A lot of those center around privacy and security, perhaps not surprisingly. But we also get a lot of pushback that employees are going to feel threatened, right? The idea of robots taking everyone's jobs. In fact, that's not really how AI, especially as it's built into communications tools, works, at least not when it's deployed properly. So again, if you think of a contact center, you want to have AI to improve the communications that you're having with your customers, to make them more contextual, to make sure that you're popping up information to those agents, for example, that is going to allow them to service those customers better. But you're not really taking away the agent. Now, in some cases you are. There are certain types of communications that can be handled entirely by machine. But in a sense, then what that's allowing you to do is free up those human agents to spend more time on the high touch communications. So it's not so much always getting rid of people as allowing the people that you do have to really add more value to the organization. You're taking advantage of their humanity, if you will, by offloading the stuff that machines do really well to the machines. Big data analytics is going to be really important going forward when it comes to overall 2020 budgets, and that kind of fits in with that AI messaging that we just saw. So there's going to be a lot of investment in the next year around big data and analytics. But we also see that web and video conferencing are going to get a lot of attention as well, as are group video conferencing tools. Now, one thing I would say is I would expect that group video conferencing number to probably go down a little bit, at least over the next 12 to 24 months, as companies only slowly allow people back into the office and really even have need for that kind of an environment. I do want to just jump in here and mention, if you have questions, please go ahead and post them in the question box. I am monitoring that, and I'm happy to answer questions as they come up. If you have it about the specific data that I'm going through, or indeed anything else, I'm happy to answer your questions. So we're going to finish up a little bit here by looking at mobility in the enterprise. I mentioned, so many of us are mobile employees. We were even before COVID-19. We are even more so now. And companies have clearly embraced this. So you can see that most of them are deploying a really large number of apps in the enterprise. I mean, as many as 50 or more is not uncommon. So a lot of us are used to using apps in our day-to-day lives, but we're also using them a lot in our business lives. which I think is really interesting and really kind of heartening that we've gone from just a few years ago where that 1 to 10 number was significantly higher. I mean, more and more of the enterprise tools that we use day to day are coming with apps, and we're able to access them on our mobile phones and our tablets and so on. We also see that companies are really embracing the idea of giving access to these apps to everyone. So you saw in that very first slide that about 100% of IT decision makers tell us, that their employees are using mobile devices. So they're running apps, obviously, on those devices. So they're being given to, kind of quote unquote mainstream office employees, as well as management. But they're also being given a lot to field service personnel, whether it's sales or service or delivery folks as well. And even to their contractors and their business partners. So we're starting to see those apps get extended out from the internal organization. And then companies are doing everything they can to make it easy for employees to use those apps. So they're creating their own enterprise app stores, for example. And so if you're looking for a particular app, you can just go into that enterprise store and download it onto your mobile device. They're also making sure that they're supporting those apps by providing a help desk for users. It might be internal, it might be contracted out, but either way, one place to go for support specifically for those apps. And then you're also bringing in employees to kind of weigh in on and evaluate the apps, just like we do in real life, right? We're all looking for those, 4.5, 5-star rated applications. And so we're making part of the process too. That said, the use of unauthorized mobile apps is seen as a problem. So even though so many companies are deploying so many different kinds of apps, they're still finding that their users are using others as well. And a lot of those are going to be consumer-based. And, it's a problem for a couple of reasons, right? Partly it's that you might not want them doing that particular thing on work time. So it's a consumer app and they're not supposed to be sort of quote unquote wasting their time on it. More often though, what they're worried about is that employees are using consumer grade apps with enterprise data. And those privacy and security concerns come into play there because those apps aren't necessarily secure. And there's not necessarily a good way to protect that intellectual property when it's out running on those apps. So that's become a big issue for a lot of IT managers. As a result, we're seeing more and more companies telling us that they're supporting BYOT for their employees. So what that means is they're allowing employees to bring in their own devices and in some cases use their preferred apps, but they're asking them to go through IT in some shape or form so that IT can have some control over managing those devices and managing those applications going forward. And I will say that number has increased a lot, just to go back there for a second. So even just a year or so ago, that 83% was around, 63%, something like that, where, companies knew that this was happening, but it was almost like, if I just put my head in the sand and ignore it, maybe it'll go away. And I think what's happened is they realize they can't take that approach. They actually do have to support these efforts if they want to really sustain security and privacy initiatives. And you can see here a lot of the same reasons companies are deploying other types of technologies. They're deploying these mobile apps, right? So they want more productive employees. They want them to be more efficient, and they want the processes overall to be more efficient. And ultimately, they want to inspire that collaboration. And as I mentioned, you can see security and loss of control, which I talked about in terms of use of consumer apps, is also one of the reasons companies don't deploy other mobile apps than what they already do. And, there are definitely concerns around that. So anytime, you have an app and it's on a mobile device, it feels like it could get out of control. I will say, though, that you're better off deploying an enterprise grade app that remains under the control of the IT department than saying, well, I don't really want to do that because, I'm worried about security and privacy. Because if you do that, it will, probably backfire on you, and you will end up with those same security and privacy issues that you had before. I am just going to jump in here and say that my slide deck right now seems to have jumped back to the opening slide, and I can't get it to go to the slide that I want to talk to at the moment. So apologies if what you're seeing is in fact this opening slide. The system just kind of jumped back to that for me. If you are in fact seeing a slide that shows information on advanced technologies and what's in use today, then terrific. If you are not, I apologize for your not being able to see it. I only have a couple slides left, so I'll just talk through them without your being able to see them. Hopefully the data will make sense. Basically, what we were looking at is advanced technologies in use today are on the roadmap. So we find that about a third of all companies are currently using smart glasses. Yes, those are the things like Google Glass that we all thought kind of crashed and burned a couple years ago, but in fact they are in use in a lot of organizations today, primarily in manufacturing kind of sectors where they can really do a lot of good. We also see smartwatches in about a quarter of all organizations, and 5G mobile devices are kind of coming up. And those numbers are all expected to increase over the next couple of years. So again, when it comes to the kinds of devices that companies are using, they are definitely looking outside of the box. And then finally, when it comes to managing all of these different devices and applications, we find that the majority of organizations are using an EMM platform or suite, or they plan to do so within 1 to 3 years. And that's something that can really be effective if you've got a whole lot of devices, a whole lot of apps, a whole lot of employees who are mobile, making sure that you have one way to manage all of that stuff, to manage access, to cut people off all at once, to bring people on all at once can be very, very important. Finally, just want to end by sort of saying again, COVID-19 has changed a lot about the way in which we work, and we kind of expect it to continue to do so for the foreseeable future. So keeping in mind that a lot of this data was taken before all of this hit. But that said, I think some of the underlying trends, are going to stick with us. And certainly being able to support your employees, regardless of where they're working, being able to kind of change on a dime, right? Send everybody home on Friday and not really knowing that was going to happen, on Thursday is a really big deal. And we've all done it once now, and I think we're all preparing to be able to do it again and again. So having the underlying technology to support that is really, really important. So hopefully this was helpful. And if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. If you can't see my contact information because you're not seeing the slides, again, I apologize. But you can certainly reach out to me via email. It's just melanie.turek@frost.com. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to get back to you. In the meantime, thanks for joining me today, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.